Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Arielle Cates. I'm the Director of Programming at Village Preservation. So glad that you're here with us this evening to celebrate the 150th birthday of Emery Roth, the architect of our city. We're so pleased to be joined tonight by our partners at Friends of the Upper East Side, Landmark West, and the Historic Districts Council, and thank them for their partnership. Please learn more about them and their work via the links that I'm putting in the chat right now. And we're so glad tonight also to be presenting this event as part of the American Institute of Architecture's Archtober. So just a quick bit about Village Preservation. We have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development, while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history, and depth, and the value of preservation in our communities. We are a nonprofit membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. You can learn more at our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. So just a bit of Zoom protocol. I won't be visible during the talk, but I'll be here. So please feel free, as some of you have done already, to use the chat to say hi, tell us where you're joining from, or to raise any issues or thoughts. If you do have questions for our speakers specifically though, please use the Q&A function. It just helps me to keep track of them. You can do that at any point during the talk, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So I'm so delighted to introduce tonight's speakers to you in order of appearance. Shelley Hera is the archivist in the Department of Drawings and Archives at the Avery Architectural and Fine Arts Library at Columbia University, where she's been since 2010. She oversees the physical and intellectual management of over 2 million drawings, photographs, letters, and manuscripts related to architecture. During her time at Avery, Shelley has served as a key organizer and principal cataloger also of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation Archives, which was jointly acquired by Avery Library and the Museum of Modern Art. Andrew Dolkart is a professor of historic preservation at the Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and the former director of the school's historic preservation program. Professor Dolkart is an authority on the preservation of historically significant architecture and an expert in the architecture and development of New York City. Before joining the faculty at Columbia, he held a position at the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission and also worked as a consultant. Professor Dolkart holds a Bachelor of Arts from Colgate University and a Master's of Science in Historic Preservation from Columbia, and he's also a popular lecturer. So thank you for doing that here with us. Emery Roth, Teddy Roth studied both design and language arts at Carnegie Mellon University, simultaneously earning degrees in architecture and literature. After 40 years living and teaching in Connecticut's Northwest Hills, he became fascinated with the old mill towns of the Naugatuck Valley and their history, and he began photographing the men at their work, traveling back in time and learning how it all came to be. I'm going to link you to his book about this. It's marvelous. Roth is also a family archivist and is working on digitizing his father's letters, touching on World War II, the future of Roth and Sons, and more. Richard Roth Jr. practiced architecture from the early 1960s through the 1990s as part of the third generation of the family firm Emery Roth and Sons. Rising to chief architect, Richard led the designs for many high-rises in the booming post-war development of Manhattan, including 55 Water Street and the Palace Hotel, and as the architect of record for the World Trade Center and the Pan Am MetLife building. So thank you all so very much for being here. I'm going to turn this evening over to our first speaker, Shelley.
I'm going to share my screen. And just confirming you can see my presentation?
Yes.
Great. Okay.
No, sorry, can't see it.
Okay. Let me reshare my screen. Share screen. Oh, here we go. Sorry. We're good?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Here we go. So good evening, everyone. I'm Shelley Hayray. I'm the archivist at Avery Architectural and Fine Arts Library at Columbia University. Our archives, known as Avery Drawings and Archives, collects drawings, photographs, and architectural records documenting the architectural history and design practices. Primarily, our strengths are American and New York City architecture of the 19th and 20th century. Since 1976, we have been the repository for the Emery Roth archive, and in 2006, we acquired the extensive archive for Emery Roth and Sons. I want to speak to you today about our Emery Roth collection at Avery, but first, I thought it might be helpful to sketch out the early biographical history of this iconic New York architect. Emery Roth was born 150 years ago on July 17, 1871 in Galsich, Hungary. His parents owned the local hotel, which was run by Roth's mother. Roth's father was of poor health throughout much of Roth's childhood and died in 1883 when Emery was 12 years old. Not being able to send Emery back to school in Budapest, Roth's mother decided he should emigrate to the United States, where she had heard there were unlimited opportunities for young boys. Coincidentally, at this time, a man named Mr. Kiss, a real estate agent from Chicago, was visiting his parents in Galsich. He agreed to take the young Emery Roth to America and to find the boy a job. Roth traveled separately from his chaperone on the trip to America and only saw this Mr. Kiss once more after his arrival in New York, when the man gave him a railroad ticket to Chicago and a slip of paper with his address on it. Roth writes in his autobiography, "Waiting for the train I was to take, I spent 2 drizzly March days in New York. What I saw of it did not greatly impress me. The streets were lined with telegraph poles and a maze of wires. I tried to appreciate the famed elevated structures and even tramped over to the Brooklyn Bridge, but nothing measured up to the illustrations I had seen." When Roth arrived in Chicago a few days later, he had lost the address of Mr. Kiss. He decided to wait at the train station, hoping someone would know of the address of Mr. Kiss, a man he assumed was well known in Chicago. While waiting at the train station, he pulled out his watercolors and started drawing pictures. He attracted a crowd of spectators, which included a group of German-speaking soldiers. A soldier found out that the 13-year-old boy had nowhere to go and offered to bring the newly arrived child to a military encampment in Bloomington, Illinois. This is how Roth ended up spending his first few years in America in Bloomington, Illinois, working odd jobs and living with a local family who ran the town's boarding house. Roth's various jobs during this time included shoe shining, apprenticing to a barber, cleaning bathhouses, and a newspaper route. Finally, it was a job at the local druggist that began his career in architecture. The artistic Emery was bored at work and decided to draw murals on the cellar wall of the drugstore. While the druggist was annoyed, he couldn't help but be impressed by the young man's talent and ended up bringing his architect brother, George, around to meet the precocious youth. Architect George H. Miller was not much interested in hiring Emery, but the young boy was very eager, and the architect finally agreed to take Roth on as an unpaid apprentice. In 1889, after the completion of his apprenticeship, the 18-year-old Roth decided to move to Kansas City, where he had heard there was a building boom and many opportunities for a young architect. Unfortunately, by the time he arrived in Kansas City, there were no more jobs to be had. However, his misfortune didn't last too long, and he soon secured a job as a draftsman on the architectural staff of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition through the offices of Burnham and Root. In his autobiography, Roth writes that his time in Chicago was where his higher education began, and even goes as far as to say the World's Columbian Exposition was my beneficent alma mater. A turning point in Roth's career happened one Saturday afternoon while working in the drafting room of the exposition. A panicked man ran into the empty drafting room to find only the young Emery Roth still around for the day. This panicked man ended up being no other than Richard Morris Hunt. Roth writes in his autobiography, "It was evident that Mr. Hunt considered me too young and inexperienced, but he had no alternative, so he delegated his instructions to me to be transmitted to my chief. As we progressed, he began to place more faith in my ability. By evening, what with sketches, scale details, and memorandum, Mr. Hunt appeared to have more confidence in my ability to transmit his instructions to my superior, and to believe that his difficulties were fairly solved. I mentioned that when my work at the fair was over, I intended to go to that mecca of all draftsmen, New York. And Hunt replied, 'When you do, I'll gladly make a place for you in my office.'" After the close of the fair in Chicago, Roth returned to New York for the first time since his arrival to America 9 years prior. It was now 1893, and Roth was 22 years old. Shortly after his arrival, he was hired by the office of Richard Morris Hunt for $25 a week to make preliminary sketches for private residences. While working in Hunt's office, Roth came to know Ogden Codman, who was designing the interiors for the Breakers, a Hunt-designed Newport mansion for Cornelius Vanderbilt. Codman was impressed by the young Roth and offered him a job in his own office. Roth accepted the offer and worked for Codman for a few years. As Stephen Ruttenbaum notes in his book Mansions in the Clouds, his work with Codman provided him with a basic knowledge of the housing requirements of the wealthy, a knowledge he used in later years when designing luxury apartments. Roth was really interested in establishing his own firm after a few years, but he faced significant challenges in that he couldn't rely on clients drawn from his social circle like the aristocratic Codman could. In 1898, Roth had saved enough money to buy the existing architectural practice of Theodore G. Stein and E. Yancey Cohen for $1,000. The firm for the first year was named Stein, Cohen, and Roth before the name was changed to Emery Roth Architects. While Roth did not have Vanderbilts to rely on for commissions, he was able to secure jobs from his acquaintances, including his first independent commission for the alteration to Cafe Boulevard, a Hungarian restaurant on 2nd Avenue in the Lower East Side. In these early years, Roth built up a small but strong clientele among the Jewish Hungarian emigre community in New York. For many of Roth's early years on his own, he would submit plans to speculative builders, oftentimes getting ripped off in the process. However, Roth's luck began to change when he secured his first large commission to design the Saxony Apartments on 82nd and Broadway in 1899. And not long after, he secured his second large commission a few blocks south for the Hotel Belclair. It was the Hotel Belclair that changed the course of Roth's practice. The real estate developer brothers Leo and Alexander Bing of Bing and Bing were impressed by this new building being built on Broadway, and they hired Emery Roth to design the exteriors of their new apartment development on 136th Street between Broadway and Riverside. As Tom Shachtman writes in Skyscraper Dreams, thus began a grand marriage between the developer and an architect that would last for the next 45 years and create many of the jewels of New York's skyline. So now I want to turn my attention to the Emery Roth Archive at Avery Drawings and Archives, but briefly I'd like to describe one of our other significant Roth holdings, which is the Emery Roth and Sons collection. In 2006, the Emery Roth and Sons Archive joined Avery Library. The collection is significantly larger than our Emery Roth archive and includes not only architectural drawings, but also project photographs, project files, specifications, as well as extensive office records. The collection includes drawings and records for nearly 800 projects spanning from the late 1940s until the 1990s. While the bulk of the projects are for New York City, the collection also includes drawings and records for many international projects in countries including, among others, Australia, China, Hungary, Poland, Portugal, and Thailand. But today our focus is on Emery Roth. The Emery Roth Archive was donated by Emery Roth and Sons in 1976, and the collection contains 2,286 architectural drawings and a 2-volume copy of Emery Roth's autobiography. The collection includes drawings for 117 projects. All but 8 of those projects are located in Manhattan. The majority of the drawings are ink on linen with some pencil on trace drawings as well as blueprints. Unfortunately, there are no perspective renderings or presentation drawings. The collection is very much made up of working drawings, with the bulk of the drawings being floor plans, though there are many projects that also include elevation drawings. We are very lucky in that Roth's most iconic commissions are represented in our collection, including the Beresford, the San Remo, the Normandy, and the Ritz Tower. However, this collection is not a comprehensive record of Roth's prolific portfolio and is missing drawings for some projects, including Bancroft Hall on 121st Street here in Morningside Heights, 59 West 12th Street in the Village, or the Warwick Hotel on 54th Street. The drawings in our collection are typically cataloged by building type, with the majority of the collection being either listed as an apartment house, like the Beresford or the San Remo, or an apartment hotel, like the Belclair or the Ritz Tower. While Roth is known today as the preeminent pre-war architect of apartment houses, as our collection shows, he was designing many apartment hotels in the 1910s and the 1920s. Many of Roth's apartment hotels have been reclassified in our modern perspective and used as apartment houses. Examples include the Oliver Cromwell on the Upper West Side and the Ritz Tower in Midtown East, both which were originally designed as apartment hotels. Both the apartment houses and the apartment hotels by Emery Roth were designed as luxury residential buildings. The main difference was, while apartment houses were allowed under zoning laws to have private kitchens, apartment hotels could only have a pantry and would need to rely on shared services, typically including a restaurant on the street level, as well as maid services and other hotel conveniences. As Stephen Ruttenbaum writes in Mansions in the Clouds, apartment hotels provided a new and uniquely American way to set up a house, combining the characteristics of a boarding house and the grand hotel with the apartment house. As the wealthy gave up their larger private residences during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, it became fashionable for them to build a mansion in the country as a permanent residence and to keep a smaller place in the city for the social season. The apartment hotel thus became a convenient way to maintain a home in the city. And you can see on the screen, I have what I think quite a funny review in the New Yorker for the Ritz Tower, where they're talking about the various amenities one gets in these apartment hotels and exaggerate, saying, the management provides services of every kind. I shouldn't be surprised to hear that a box at the Metropolitan went with each apartment, or that if you pressed a button, a fourth for bridge would appear. So I want to briefly jump out of my PowerPoint and go to a map visualization that I've created of the Emery Roth collection. So if we zoom out, you can see tags on the map, and each tag represents a project that is in our collection so that we have architectural drawings for. And you can see this is a very much New York-based archive, but we do have a tag here. So if we zoom in, we have 3 projects in Lakewood, New Jersey for 1 hotel and 2 houses. And this is circa early 1920s. So let's go back up to New York City on the map. So we can see there are some projects here in Westchester, Queens, and Brooklyn, but primarily, as I said, this is a Manhattan-based archive. So let's zoom in on Manhattan. You can see we have different colors on this map. The red are for apartment hotels, the green are for apartment houses, and the gray are for non-residential buildings. So the bulk of our collection are apartment houses, and then the second most common building type is apartment hotel. If we zoom in more and get our street numbers, we point out a few interesting projects. Over here on 101st Street is the apartment Emery Roth designed with the penthouse that his family lived in for many years, and I believe the Roths will be talking about that later. If we go up Manhattan, and we're in Hamilton Heights and Washington Heights, you'll see we don't have too many projects, which we know is not actually representative of Roth. He did many more projects that are represented in our collection. If we keep going up, Again, we're not seeing as many projects as exist, but over here we have a little cluster on Wadsworth Terrace of apartment houses circa early 1920s. Up here, let's go back down to the Upper West Side. On the Upper West Side, and we can point out a few of the really iconic buildings. Of course, we have the Normandy over here. Our drawings date from 1938 to 1940. Go over here. We have the Beresford, and our drawings are primarily from the late 1920s. Of course, the San Remo, and an apartment hotel over here, the Oliver Cromwell, and then another apartment hotel, one of the second big commission, the Hotel Belclair. So if we cross over the park onto the east side, on the Upper East Side, we don't see any apartment houses in our collection in this area, but we see a lot of apartment houses being built primarily on this Park Avenue, which we know was being redeveloped heavily during this 1920s building boom in the city, and then some apartment houses on Fifth Avenue. If we go down into Midtown East, we're starting to see more apartment hotels, including, of course, the very famous Ritz Tower. And if we move over into Midtown, we're starting to see, this is where there's the biggest cluster of non-residential by Roth, including primarily office buildings over here, some of which are unidentified, a loft building. And then let's go down to the Village. Down to the Village. And, you know, we don't have the same amount of projects as we do, of course, on the Upper West Side, Upper East Side, but we do have some interesting things happening here, including an apartment house designed for Grove and Bleecker, which was, as if we all know, that corner was never built, and probably because this is 1930. And then the Shenandoah over here on Sheridan, and the very iconic One University Place, which was originally designed as an apartment hotel. So I just want to zoom back out just so we can really take all this in one more time and just reiterate that this is 117 projects and does not merely represent all of the commissions, but does represent what is in our collection. And now I just want to make a plea that you're welcome to join us and come look at our collection here. You can see there's an image of our reading room, and this is, I pulled the drawings for the Ritz Tower, and they're very large drawings. You're welcome to make appointments. Currently, the university has put in COVID restrictions, so our reading room is restricted at this time to Columbia students and faculty, but we're hoping to have more normal operations by 2022 when we would start booking appointments for the public again. In the meantime, feel free to email us at averydrawings@columbia.edu, or also please visit our website and you can find our finding aids for our Roth collections and get a better sense of what projects are represented in our collection. So I will stop sharing and I will pass over to you, Andrew.
Okay, I hope everybody can hear me and that it's clear. So Emery Roth, there's the famous picture that you've already seen once. Emery Roth was, of course, a major designer and one of the few apartment house designers who has had a full-scale monographic study. And I really have to thank Steve Ruttenbaum, who wrote the monograph, and unfortunately died shortly thereafter. But it's really a wonderful introduction to Emery Roth. And Emery Roth designed some really extraordinary works. But he was one of several architects of great talent who worked in the realm of upper middle class apartment houses and apartment hotels, largely on the Upper West Side, the Upper East Side, and Greenwich Village. Among them, Rosario Candela, Gaetano Yellow, George and Edward Blum, and others. They all made a contribution, and one historian or another will probably argue that each of them was the best, but I think that this is irrelevant. They all contributed to the creation of the residential neighborhoods of apartment buildings that we know and love in the 21st century. Roth's name is better known than others because the firm lasted for several generations, and I think because he designed two of the most noticeable and finest apartment buildings in New York, the San Remo and the Beresford, both on Central Park West. These are well-known buildings, but also there's something of a mystery, as we'll see. Of course, we will look at these two great buildings, but I think that what will be interesting is to look at the full scope of Roth's architectural career and also place his career within the context of architecture and development during the decades in which he was active. Of course, this is a big topic, and in only 20 minutes, I can just begin to skim the surface. Roth entered the New York architectural world in 1898 when he purchased the practice of Theodore Stein and E. Yancey Cohn with the agreement that his new firm should be known as Stein, Cohn, and Roth for at least 1 year. He received a few small commissions, largely from Hungarian immigrants, but his breakthrough came in 1899 with the commission of the Saxony Apartments on Broadway and 82nd Street, a building that received its name because it was commissioned by Albert Sachs. Sachs was a New York-born real estate developer of German ancestry. He typifies the Jewish developers who were responsible for the construction of many of the apartment houses and apartment hotels of the early decades of the 20th century and who hired Roth to design their buildings. This was Roth's entry into the world of apartment house design. It's an okay work, but hardly a masterpiece. It's a bit overdone, but with some nice details. You can see that strange contrast of the stone, the brick, the terracotta. There's marble panels up on the 6th floor. There's a metal work at the cornice. There's some beautiful passages. I love this juxtaposition of the blocks with these kind of ornamented circles or guillage patterns in here. Let's look a bit at the context of apartment house design at the time that Roth entered the profession. Roth became active. Apartment living began to become an acceptable mode of living for the middle and upper middle classes as early as 1869 with the construction of the Stuyvesant Apartments, said to be the first apartment building specifically planned to attract the middle class. But it was not until the 1880s that significant numbers of apartments for affluent households began to appear, including the Dakota and the Osborne, both still very prominent in the city. By about 1900, apartments were appearing in all of the fashionable neighborhoods of the city, on the Upper West Side, on the Upper East Side, and in Greenwich Village, the Dorilton, the Verona, and the Fifth Avenue that you're seeing here. The Saxony fits in here, especially on the Upper West Side, where several Beaux-Arts style apartment buildings and apartment hotels, absolutely dripping with ornament, were erected. And here you can see the Dorilton, which is about the same time as the Saxony, and the Kenilworth on Central Park West, which is a couple of years later. So apartment house living was already acceptable for affluent middle-class households, if not yet acceptable for the very, very wealthy by 1900. But a major impetus for the construction of large numbers of apartment houses was rising land values in Manhattan that made it prohibitively expensive for all but the very wealthiest to build single-family dwellings. Land values were especially impacted by the development of mass transit, notably the construction of the first IRCT subway line, which you see here being built just around where Lincoln Center is today, which culminated in the opening of this line in 1904. Once the route of the subway was announced and construction got underway, the development of tall apartment houses and apartment hotels began to appear along the route. Roth was one of the architects poised to take advantage of this demand. The first buildings that Roth designed on the Upper West Side and in the first buildings that Roth designed were on the Upper West Side and in Washington Heights between 1903 and 1910. And they're truly extraordinary because they are so different from anything else being built in the city at that time. Albert Sachs was clearly impressed with what Roth had produced at the Saxony. And in 1901, he commissioned a hotel from Roth on Broadway and West 77th Street. And this is the Hotel Belclair, which you can see here in an early photograph on the left and a photograph from about 2 weeks ago on the right. The Belclair is unusual because it was influenced by Central European Art Nouveau architecture, what's known as the secession design or the Viennese secession. This was something that Roth learned probably from a colleague when he was in Chicago working on the World's Columbian Exposition, and there were students of the Wagner School working there as well. And here you can see one of Wagner's great apartment houses in Vienna. And you'll see motifs here that Roth uses on several buildings, including the Belclaire, the circular shield-like roundels, the dripping panels with vertical incised lines, the blocks of foliage, the use of geometries often juxtaposed with ornamental features, the use of ironwork for ornamental detail. He doesn't copy anything by Wagner, but he adapts a lot of the Central European Art Nouveau secession forms. As you can see here in some details from the Belclaire, the use of foliage here, probably chestnut leaves that appear all over the facade, the shield-like forms, the incised vertical lines, the sort of whiplash ornamental detail, and the use of heads, which was very common in the Central European secession-inspired ornamental details. And you can also see that he used here, especially the vertical lines here, very much out of Wagner's work. Unusual window sash panels. Here you can see the curved window sash, and here divided into unusual shapes, and this beautiful stylized ironwork, all on that survive on the Belclaire. The use of Art Nouveau was very knowingly done, and and as you can see, this is an ad from 1905 from a newspaper that the Belclaire put out called the Belclaire Hotel News, and it's advertising the Art Nouveau roof garden. So they understand that they're doing something very different here in New York. And this is a wedding that took place in the Belclaire, and ignore the wedding group, but look at all of the Art Nouveau ornament at the back. In this case, rather French Art Nouveau ornament that you see behind. And those of you who are real New York architecture fans may recognize this building from the same period as the Belclaire. This was a 3-story hotel on 38th Street and 8th Avenue that miraculously still survives and is not a city landmark, although it should be, but uses a lot of the same architectural details as the Belclaire. And one of my favorite buildings from this period, and Roth used the secession designs until about 1910. This is the Haladon Court on Broadway and 153rd Street, in which he introduces the use of sgraffito, that is a kind of stucco plaster that's incised with ornament and then colored. And you can see this kind of stylized butterfly over here, intricate brickwork, the shields and the vertical designs and the foliage that we've seen before. And here's more sgraffito. There's some color left, but a lot of the color has faded from these. And here you can see again the foliage that is typical, and the heads that are typical of Roth's use of Central European secession design. Also quite wonderful is the Bancroft on 121st Street. And I'm showing you this just to show that these Art Nouveau buildings could be quite controversial because they were so different from the traditional work going on in New York. This was commissioned in 1910 by a developer named Louis Eisenberg. For reasons unknown, the New York Times refers to the design as Spanish in style. I'm sorry, but I don't see that. Maybe one of you does. Upon its completion, the building was advertised as the Sethlow Kitchenette Apartments or the Sethlow Bachelor Apartments. That is Sethlow, one word, named for Seth Low, 2 words, who was the former president of Columbia and the person that was responsible for bringing Columbia up to Morningside Heights. However, Columbia's former president, Seth Low, was not consulted about having a speculative apartment building named in his honor, only finding out about this dubious honor when he saw an advertisement in the newspapers. The New York Times reported that Seth Low doesn't mind lending his name to cities, colleges, and charities when they think it may help them along. But when it comes to apartment houses, especially apartment houses which look over Mr. Low's beloved Columbia University, and this is the important point, which shock the finer senses of the young ladies who are studying art in Teachers College by alleged architectural incongruities, ex-Mayor Low firmly draws the line. And so the name was changed from Seth Low to Bancroft. But it's interesting that this was seen as architectural incongruities by using this kind of design. All of these buildings have an arts and crafts sensibility that never left Roth and is especially evident in some of his finest buildings, as we'll see. Roth's office prospered during the next decades, designing apartment houses and apartment hotels, largely through his relationship with Jewish builders. These buildings were all speculative ventures on the part of their builders. Speculative building had a long history in New York among immigrants and the children of immigrants, because you didn't need to raise a huge amount of money. So a lot of Irish immigrants built Brooklyn row houses. German immigrants built the tenements on the Lower East Side. And Roth was part of a group of Jewish and Italian architects who worked largely with Jewish and Italian developers, including Bing and Bing, Sam Minskoff, and members of the Uris family, to create really important apartment buildings. Roth received, so here are some details of the Bancroft and the original drawing. Roth received commissions in the pre-World War I period along avenues that were rapidly developing into some of the most prestigious in New York City, including West End Avenue and Park Avenue. These were largely commissions from Albert Sachs and Bing, among the most active firms in the city. West End developed as an apartment house boulevard during this period because of the construction of the IRT subway, and Park Avenue began to attract apartment house developers when the open railroad cut for the suburban rail lines was covered over. And you can see examples of these apartment houses. The one on the right, 417 Park Avenue, is being demolished as we speak, or the demolition may actually be completed on 55th Street, unfortunately. These are very kind of traditional apartment houses, and they also show you that Roth could design nice upper middle class apartment houses. There are 4 apartments per floor on this building, but also really luxurious apartment buildings like this one on the right, which is the one that's being demolished, which was 1 apartment per floor. There was a building hiatus during World War I. Roth has already shown his proficiency at efficiently designing apartment buildings that would bring financial rewards to their developers. Thus, after the war ended and when construction began again in earnest in the early 1920s, Roth was well poised to receive new commissions. And in the boom market of the 1920s, he was enormously successful, designing key apartment buildings of the era, as well as many less noticeable buildings and many apartment hotels. He was also able to design for apartment buildings with layouts for different markets, including luxury buildings on the Upper East Side, upper middle class buildings on the Upper West Side, and buildings with small apartments for single people and couples without children in Greenwich Village. It was during this period that Roth perfected the style of building for which he is best known, a New York adaptation of Italian Renaissance or Baroque design. And you can see it here in 3 buildings on the Upper West Side in Greenwich Village and on the Upper East Side, which often use beige brick with bold Renaissance and Baroque inspired ornament, often in terracotta, as you can see on the left here. These are on the 81st Street building. And he loved having these panels where you might expect the name of the building, but there's rarely anything in this panel. This period culminates with the 2 great examples of his work, the Beresford and the San Remo, which you can see here on Central Park West, which use that Renaissance ornament, a Renaissance ornamental character that he had perfected. And you can see that on the San Remo on the left and the Beresford on the right. And you can see the really Baroque detail on the upper right here. These buildings are a bit of a mystery. You read a lot about them, but nobody ever talks about who built them. So who was the builder of these buildings? And that nobody has really known. And it appears that they were the work of the owners of Bank of United States, not Bank of the United States, but Bank of United States, which was founded by Bernard Marcus and another textile merchant. These were garment district developers. Oh, Saul Singer. They were garment developers who got involved in banking, and they got in way over their head. And when the market crashed, it was one of the largest banks to collapse. And thus, these buildings were eventually foreclosed on. But it appears that they didn't want anyone to know at the time, but they were the force behind the construction of both of these buildings. Roth never lost his interest in the arts and crafts and the use of materials in a very, very high level. We see that in the terracotta at the Beresford and the San Remo, and here, the mid-block building here on Fifth Avenue in Greenwich Village, which, if you stand across the street from it for a while and take a look, has spectacular polychrome terracotta. I went and photographed it about 5 days ago, and I had never really stood and looked at such detail at the incredible high quality of the polychrome terracotta on this building. And there are several other buildings, including one on West End Avenue, that use similar polychrome terracotta. And he loved tile work. As you can see here, this is the dining room in his apartment that was mentioned earlier, and it uses Moravian tiles from Henry Mercer's Moravian Tile Works on the floor and on the wainscoting. And this is also probably Moravian tile. This is from the lobby of the Hotel Montclair. This is lost, but apparently, according to members of the Roth family who have been inside this apartment, the tile work apparently is still there, which is fantastic. And you also can see his love of craft on my favorite Emery Roth building, which is the Shenandoah at 10 Sheridan Square. This is an interesting building built by Bing and Bing at a time when apartment buildings were just tall apartment houses were just beginning to appear in Greenwich Village. And they were appearing with very small apartments for single people and couples without children. And the census shows that there were only 3 households with a child in this building. And they probably lived in the largest apartments up in the penthouse area. This is a building with spectacular craftsmanship, stonework and cast stone and terracotta and tile and stone carving, just amazing details here. You can see the stonework contrasting with the patterned brickwork, and over the door, the grapevines, and flanking the entrance. The building is being held up by this bearded figure and another on the other side. These are underneath the canopy. You have to go take a look. And then all these mythological sea creatures and lions, just amazing detail on this building. And tiles, unidentifiable tile firm in the lobby. And you'll see that the apartments are mostly 1-room studios and 2-room, 1-bedroom and living area apartments. So this is very different from what he was building for the clientele in the Beresford and the San Remo. Also, he got involved in designing small apartments for more affluent people who wanted to live, who could no longer afford to live in grand apartments, and so are living in these smaller apartments, like you see here in what's called the East Village mansionettes. Don't you love that word, mansionette? And you can see that they're basically 2-room and 3-room apartments. And 1-room, 1, 2, and 3-room apartments. This is a group of 5 or 6 buildings on East 73rd Street. He also, as was mentioned, designed apartment hotels. And apartment hotels were a way for developers to get around the building laws, because you could build to any height on a larger part of your lot area than you could in an apartment house, but you couldn't put in a kitchen. And this was a complete ruse, because all the developers put in pantries with refrigerators and then counters with outlets, so you could go out and buy yourself a hot plate and plug it in. And everybody knew that this was happening, but it was a way that speculative builders got around the rules of the housing laws. And here you can see 2 of the most famous, using those same Renaissance features that we talked about before, the Oliver Cromwell and the Ritz. And here you can see the Renaissance base of the Oliver Cromwell and the spectacular lobby, unfortunately gone now. As the Depression approaches, Roth gets involved in the new modern or Art Deco design, as you can see here at the Ardsley on Central Park West, and most famously at the Normandy, which has that same sort of massing as the Beresford with its towers, but now using a combination of Renaissance and modern ornament. Particularly, and its love of craft, is this magnificent concave mosaic entrance, which also, and relatively small apartments now. This concave mosaic entrance also appears on one of his 2 buildings in the Bronx, which is 888 Grand Concourse. also a sort of streamlined modern building with a spectacular lobby, still intact. I took these pictures just over a year ago, just before the pandemic, with its terrazzo floor and its mosaic bowl here. And then finally, Roth dies in 1948, and he goes out. By this time, he had joined with his sons in Emery Roth and Sons, and this building was completed on the left in 1948. And it's a sort of stripped down version of that massing that Roth loved. So this is an architect who designed, was so responsible for creating the character of New York neighborhoods that we love, and is really worth our while to be studying and going out and looking at and appreciating his work. So I'm going to hand it over to either Teddy or Richard. I'm not sure who's next.
I think it's me. Hello?
It is, yes. And I'm going to share my screen. So you tell me when to go to the next slide. Okay.
Okay.
All right, here we go.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you for that discussion of my grandfather's work. I'm going to talk about his adolescence and childhood, primarily in Galzesha, Hungary, and coming to this country. He was born in 1871 in Galzesha, a small town in the Carpathian Mountains of Slovakia. Today, it's about a 4-hour drive to Budapest. So he was not near a whole lot of culture, but he went to school in Budapest for a number of years. In Galzesha, his parents ran a small country inn, and he reports that from about the age of 6, he was given tremendous freedom. He spent a lot of time in the coffee house of the inn, where everybody in town met and where all sorts of people passed through. And in the inn, hanging around, he recalls speaking and hearing multiple languages: Magyar, Slovak, Polish, German, Yiddish. Of course, his native language was Magyar, Hungarian. His family was Jewish, but he never identified particularly as being Jewish. He never denied it either, but he didn't attend synagogue. Next slide, please. Excellent. This is Galzesha, and I believe that may be the inn that the arrow is pointing to. It was the only 2-story building in town. And if we could go to the next slide. This is the synagogue in town, which he didn't attend. He didn't have a Jewish education. And our father, Richard, described Emery as basically being anti-clerical. He had 4 children who he sent to the ethical culture schools, and at ethical, my brother and I also went there. Ethical behavior was always valued over ceremony. Our mother and father were married by a leader of the ethical society. In his autobiography, Emery says he was one of 8 children. We've yet to identify all of them. But his secret power growing up was clearly drawing. And it was his favorite activity. He reports about watching the local painters who painted pottery in town and looking at their technique. And for a year, he was tutored by a Dr. Greenwald, whose office was filled with anatomical drawings, which Emery copied. And Dr. Greenwald was a nature lover. And Emery and Dr. Greenwald would take walks together, and Dr. Greenwald would identify the plants and tell Emery which ones he should draw. He says very little in his autobiography about his 3 years in Budapest, but except beyond the fact that he did very little work and he earned honors doing nothing. In autumn of 1883, at the age of 13, he arrived at school for his semester, and in November, he received word that his father had taken sick, and his 2 elder sisters were married and were moving away, and his mother was overwhelmed running the inn. Furthermore, his sisters' dowries meant that there was no money for Emery to go to school anymore. Kind of amazes me that at age 13, entirely alone, he came to the United States by ship. He was accompanied by, as was explained, by a Mr. Kiss. And Mr. Kiss held his $7, which was all the money he brought to America. But when he got to New York and he saw Mr. Kiss one more time, Mr. Kiss gave him his $7 and a ticket to Chicago and a note which gave Mr. Kiss's address so that Emery could find work when he got to Chicago. The note that Mr. Kiss gave Emery, he promptly lost and never met Mr. Kiss again. I'd like to fast forward through the 8 or so years that he spent in Bloomington, Indiana, in Illinois, and in Kansas City, and work up to the point where he got to the Chicago World's Fair. In 1893, perhaps sometimes in 1892, he received a letter telling him that he was accepted onto the architectural staff of the 1893 Columbian exhibition. Imagine this child coming from Hungary alone at the greatest World's Fair of all time, arguably, certainly the most important for architecture. Thank you for flipping ahead. The 93 World's Fair brought together the world's greatest architects. It showcased Daniel Burnham's City Beautiful movement, and Burnham envisioned heavenly classical cities on earth. Beaux-Arts tradition provided solidity and promoted civility and order in society. It was a classical marble civility built on iron frames. The planners were Burnham, Frederick Law Olmsted, Charles McKim, and Augustus St. Gaudens. They designed a court of honor and a basin around which architects would create Beaux-Arts masterpieces, their ideal of architectural beauty. And the City Beautiful movement went a long way to transforming American cities. The fair lasted 6 months, but the fair's architecture projected the ideals of the Beaux-Arts design right up through World War II. Among the many cities that it transformed, the nation's capital was one. Let me skip ahead here. The fair gave Emery access to a library, an immense library of treatises and drawings of classical design, and he began working under John Root, who died, and when Charles Atwood took over directing the design of the fair, Emery was assigned to Julius Harder, who he worked closely with on the Palace of Fine Arts. And Harder made Emery into, sorry, lost my place. Harder promoted Emery to a job captain on 2 projects, and this is one of them, design for a chocolate company. It was duplicated by a second one that had prominent places in at the fair. At the fair, as it was being built, Emery had the chance to frequent many artist studios, got to know Francis Millet, became friends with the sculptor Carl Ritter, who evidently sculpted Emery into the Trinity Doors churches in Manhattan. He spent 2 years working on the fair in an atmosphere of creativity and ferment. I'd call it a 2-year charrette. He called it his MIT. On one day, as the fair was preparing to open, Richard Morris Hunt came into his office, gave him, and he worked with Mr. Hunt through the weekend, and on that Monday had prepared an elaborate model for Mr. Hunt, who was so impressed that he gave Emery a letter of introduction to bring to his firm in New York City, and that brought Emery to New York. Of course, after the fair, there was a glut of artists in Chicago, and so going to New York was the logical move with Hunt's letter of introduction. Go to the next slide, please. And so Emery came to New York, and in 1901, he created this scrapbook of his town. And on the right, you see a picture of New York before any of Emery's buildings, some of his artwork. And on the left is his brother-in-law, Eddie Grossman. In 1901, Emery married Eddie Grossman's sister, Ella. Perhaps this scrapbook was done for their honeymoon. And together, Ella and Emery dreamed of raising 10 children in a house in the country. In 1902, he started his own architectural firm, but the house in the country didn't come for another quarter of a century. And when it did come, it was on the roof of an apartment building on 101st Street in Broadway. And I pass the talk to my brother now, who will talk about that apartment. Thank you. That is Emery and Ella.
My turn.
Yeah.
My brother wrote a book called The Penthouse Karma, which basically tells the story of the penthouse and how it occurred. We moved into the penthouse during World War II, but let me start with how we got to that building. In 1939, we moved from 113th Street to 210 West 101st Street into apartment 3L. My grandfather, not Emery, but my other grandfather had died, and my mother's mother moved in with us. And we had a wonderful 7-room apartment, 3 bedrooms, kitchen, dining room, living room, and maid's room. The apartment was big enough for 2 grand pianos, as both my grandmother and our mother were pianists. In fact, our grandmother was the first woman ever to be offered a scholarship in the Graduate School of Music at Yale University. In 1942, my mother's sister was married to a conductor who was conducting the WPA Symphony Orchestra in Richmond, Virginia. His name is Paul Affelder, and he got a job with Columbia Records, which moved him from Richmond to New York. The penthouse at that point was available. Our father had enlisted in the United States Navy at the start of World War II, and in 1942 was shipped overseas to the Pacific Ocean, where he went from island to island for 2 years. We, as a family, then moved into the penthouse. My mother, our grandmother, our aunt, our uncle, and me. And let's go to the apartment. This is the entrance to 210 West 101st. When we moved in 1939, the ceiling you're looking at, which is all painted white, was totally painted in many, many colors and was quite beautiful. And along came World War II, and they could not get anybody, I gather, to repaint the ceiling, so they just painted it white. Next slide. This is the apartment that we moved into at the penthouse. 210 West 101st was basically designed in the shape of a modified H. And Emery took half of that roof and created a 7-room penthouse apartment with a huge terrace. And as you can see from the plan, the rooms were of nice size, and it was a beautifully laid out apartment. The elevator to the apartment opened into its own vestibule. Next picture. This was the vestibule. And as you see, there's a bench there by a well-known artisan who was I assume, a good friend of Emery by the name of Oscar Bach, who is represented in the collection at the Metropolitan Museum and the collection at both Teddy's house, my house, and my daughter's house. On the wall, you see a painting that was done by another friend of my grandfather, whose name is Willie Pogani. You got off the elevator and you took a right turn and you entered a small hallway. Next slide. And this hallway led you into a beautiful foyer. And as you can see, the Art Nouveau was part of his design here. And as you came in, looking at this picture, to the left would be the living room, and the doors immediately to the right here would go into the dining room. This picture was taken from the hallway that led you from the foyer back into the bedroom wing. The tile work, which Andrew has described, and now I know who did it, which I didn't know before, was just gorgeous, both on the floor and the walls. Next slide. This is looking in the other direction of the foyer, and on the left, you see the doors to the dining room. In the center, you see the door that leads back to the bedroom. And the door to the right that you see is a telephone closet. It was where the only telephone in the house was, and it was a closet. The desk you're looking at right now was an Art Nouveau desk that my brother has, and all of the accoutrements on the desk set and everything else are at my daughter's house. Next slide. Same slide. This shows the foyer again and an entrance to the terrace, to the side terrace that led to a fish pond. May we have the fish pond. Next slide. Well, that's the desk, and you can see the beautiful desk ornaments that my daughter Robin has. This is the entrance into the living room. And as you can see, the beautiful woodwork on the back, the cabinets, and the beautiful scroll work on the ceiling, which was done in plaster and all hand painted and quite beautiful. Next slide. This is looking into the living room at the two windows that face the terrace of another person. But the windows were there, and I gathered it was no problem. And as you can see, the slide, no, it's not. Yes. The beautiful fireplace, working fireplace with beautiful tile work. And over the fireplace, you see a picture of my grandmother, our grandmother, Ella. This was Ella sitting on a couch with a wonderful tapestry, which is no longer part of our family. I have no idea where it went to, but I would have loved to have had it, as I did remember it very well, as it made it out of this apartment when all the children moved out. Our grandmother and grandfather moved to the Alden Hotel, which Emery had designed, and where they had a beautiful apartment on the 6th floor that faced Central Park, and that great outcropping, stone outcropping at Central Park, which is quite wonderful to look at. Next slide. Well, this is looking in the other direction, in the living room again, and you see the woodwork, the cabinets, and the scroll work. And it was just a very interesting place for me to grow up in, although I only spent 2 years here. The only thing I was really good at school was drawing. And this apartment gave me many, many ideas. And I drew a lot. Next slide. This is the dining room. And the wonderful thing in the dining room is that you have the exit on the right that takes you out to the main part of the terrace. And you have the wonderful ceiling, again in plaster and painted, with a wonderful light fixture that I happen to have. And I have no idea whether Oscar Bach designed it or not. It's not signed, and it is just a beautiful light fixture with German glass, irreplaceable German glass, as we broke one of the pieces of glass and spent a year trying to find a match. That light fixture made it from here to my apartment at 27 West 86th Street. And then when I retired and I moved to the Bahamas and designed a house in the Bahamas, it made it to the house in the Bahamas. And it is now sitting here in Hollywood, Florida. As you can see, the doorway on the left takes you into the huge kitchen. Next slide. This is what it looks like today. And as you can see what they've done to the ceiling, you can see what they've done to the doors, what they've done to the windows. Fortunately, they were smart enough to leave the tile work, but it's almost criminal to what they have done to the entryway and the living room and the dining room and the foyer in this apartment, when it wasn't necessary to do it. Next slide. A detail of the stonework, which was quite beautiful. Next slide. This was the master bedroom, not to the style of the rest of the house, but certainly of nice size and proportion. Next. This is a fish pond, and out of the lion's mouth came water, and there were little fish, little goldfish that would swim around, and unfortunately didn't last that long. Like most goldfish that you buy don't really live that long. But the tile work and the stonework were just exceptional. Next slide. Emery, you can always tell an Emery Roth building by the fact that you never see a water tower. Now, New York is known for their wood water towers. Emery never let that wood tower be exposed. On every one of his buildings, you will see some type of a classical covering of the water tower, which most people didn't do because it was expensive. But Emery had the ability to tell the client, you have to cover that water tower, it's unsightly. And I think that was one of the first things I learned in the office. Next slide. This is the terrace. Now, during World War II, for the 2 years that we lived there before our father returned from overseas, we had vegetable gardens, and we grew tomatoes, and we grew lettuce, and we grew all those things that were difficult to get. And as you can see, this was done after we had moved out. But somebody had really turned it into a jungle. Next slide. Much to our amazement, we were contacted by the town of Dolkart, which is actually called today Sekovic, and it's now part of Slovakia. And they wanted to erect a monument to Emery, as somehow they found out he was the most famous person that ever came out of this town. And in 2011, they had a parade and a monument presented to the town. Next slide. And you can see there he is with his pipe and the monument. Now, I find this amazing. And if you go to Wikipedia and you look up the town of Sekovic, you will find his name there listed as one of the most famous people from the town. Do I have time for one more story, Ariel?
Very quick, yes.
In 1969, my wife and I decided that we were going to chase my roots, and we went to Budapest. Now, in 1956, I had a cousin who escaped from Hungary during their brief revolution, and his name was Gabor Newman. And Gabor was a pianist, and he came to the United States, and he studied piano, and then he taught piano at the University of Indiana. When my wife and I decided that we were going to go to Budapest, to Hungary, I tried to get in touch with him, but he had just dropped off the face of the earth, and I hadn't seen him for a couple of years. Well, we got on an airplane, we got to Budapest, and we stayed at the brand new Intercontinental Hotel. And the first night we had dinner in the Intercontinental Hotel, listened to a gypsy band, and then the next day we took a tour of Budapest, and I had made arrangements with the concierge for a dinner on the Buda side in a restaurant called the Pest Buda for 8 o'clock that night. Well, all over Budapest, my wife kept on saying, they all look like your relatives, or they look like Gabor. And we got back to the hotel about 6 o'clock. The concierge said our reservation was at 7 o'clock, not 8 o'clock. We quickly changed and got into a cab. And as we approached the restaurant, my wife looked out and said, that looks like cousin Gabor. That is your cousin Gabor. And he was coming out of the restaurant as we were going into the restaurant. Well, it was an amazing happenstance, and it was fate. He then took me the next day to meet Emery's half-sister. And we entered a room where they were living in Budapest on the Pest side. And on the walls were pictures of my family, Teddy's family, everybody. It was like a memorial to those people who had left Hungary and gone to the United States. And they died like 6 months later, and it was like they kind of waited for somebody from the United States to make an appearance. Now, our grandfather had been back to Hungary in 1926 and had given the half-sister's husband a suit of clothing. In 1969, he was wearing that suit of clothing, and it looked like it was brand new. an amazing story that brought tears to our eyes. And with that, I think I've said enough. And I will answer questions if there are any.
Thank you all so much, from the deeply personal to the architectural, scholarly. I'm just so, yeah, I'm so delighted about the range of all of the things that you have all brought for us. Thank you so much. I'm aware of the time. So I'll just ask a few questions, but folks, if you do have any, feel free to submit them here in the Q&A. We got a question from, well, we got really similar questions from David and from Seth and a couple of other folks about the tile work and the details that Roth used in his buildings. Was he involved in the design and the production of all of the little details, or were there suppliers of the ornament who were sort of pitching those designs? We also have a question about the Moravian tile itself, wondering if that came from the Moravian tile works in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. I feel like these questions are for you, Andrew.
Well, yes, it did. There are a few of them are definitely Moravian tiles from Henry Mercer's Moravian Tile Works in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. But there are other tiles that are unidentifiable, and Shelley knows the drawings better than I, so she should step in. But I think the tiles, you ordered the tiles, and you could choose which tiles you wanted to order, which colors, which patterns. But you didn't design them. But I think that, looking at all those Renaissance and Baroque buildings, those beige brick buildings like the San Remo and the Beresford, they have very similar but not identical ornament. And that was clearly the aesthetic of Roth. And he designed that. And I think that was true of a lot of the buildings, that he was responsible for the design. For things like the intricate detail on the Shenandoah, like the grapevines over the door, or the figures that are sort of holding the building up. My guess is that he did, but I'm not positive about that. What do you think, Shelley?
Well, we don't have any detailed drawings in the collection, really. And can everyone, sorry, I know there's been issues with hearing me. And I just did a quick search now for tile to see if, because the drawings are described at the item level, and we don't have any of those drawings. So I'm guessing that it was, with a trade and a vendor, or not a vendor, but not part of the design in terms of what they would give to the clients.
I think I can answer one of the questions. On the interior tile, there would have been drawings that would have been created by the office. And then the building, as it was being built, would be supervised by somebody from the office so that the tiles would be in the right place. And this was carried on later, in my time. So there were always drawings, detailed drawings of the tile work.
That's really great to know. Our collection doesn't represent that, but of course, just because it doesn't exist in the archive doesn't mean there wasn't a practice in place.
I think that what that means is that there was detailed drawings of where the tiles would go.
Right.
I don't think that Roth actually designed the patterns on the individual tiles. That's why you purchased from a particular art tile maker, was because you liked the patterns or the seams or the colors that they were representing.
Well, you would also work with the tile people. All the people that were producing porcelain tile in Queens would come into the office, and you would work with them in order to get what you wanted. And they would generally come in with their shop drawings, and you would then change them or accept them. And then it would be done from the shop drawings. The tile man would have his shop drawings, which would have been corrected by the office. Oh, by the way, our father was the one who supervised the construction of the penthouse. He took a year out from MIT to supervise that construction. So, and we can't ask him anymore, which we could. All those questions that Teddy and I have no answers to that we would like to get answers to, we just don't have them.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. So many questions, everyone. Thank you. Let's see. Tristan wants to know where would be the best place to get a sense of how the initial lobbies were designed.
In the archive, again, it's for having so many projects represented in the archive, it's not a very large collection. You know, we're looking at less than 3,000 drawings. For perspective, the Imperial Hotel drawings, which we have here, there are 1,000 drawings for that project. So 3,000, less than 3,000 for 170 projects, you get a sense that a lot of our collection only has maybe anywhere from 2 drawings to 15 drawings around that. So it's, and again, it really is floor plans. So in terms of the development of the building and the change in designs, that's not necessarily completely represented. It is represented maybe in the floor plans and the development of the floor plans. Andrew and I looked at a few great floor plans for the Belclair, and then we would see the different changes of primarily that first floor where they wanted to put a restaurant, and then they changed it and put a wine cellar and etc. But those are the kind of changes that are documented in the archive. Unfortunately, some of these other things that we would be interested in, you can't really look to the drawings for that.
And as somebody that is very interested in apartment houses and has done a lot of research on apartment houses, finding interior photographs of historic lobbies is very, very difficult, surprisingly difficult. Some buildings were thoroughly photographed when they were completed, especially in the 20s and the 30s, but not apparently by whatever photographer Roth hired is not one of the ones whose work seems to have been archived, like at the Museum of the City of New York. So there are some images of lobbies in Stephen Ruttenbaum's book, but he doesn't source where the images come from, and the Roths don't know where they are, and Shelley and I don't know where they are, and we hope that they turn up sometime because he has some great images in there, but we don't know where he got them from.
Yeah, Gail Green is commenting that they sometimes use the original brochures to see what the lobbies looked like. That's right, and that, for the apartment hotels, it's a lot easier. That's where I found that wonderful image of the lobby of the Oliver Cromwell. It's a brochure for the Oliver Cromwell that's in my collection. And there are a lot more brochures for the hotels than there are for the apartment houses. Avery also has a superb collection of real estate prospectuses, about a third of which are digitized and available to the public. And so those sometimes are useful, but the issue with those is that they're not always as useful. Is often they were printed before the building was completed because they were trying to market it so that when it was completed, people would move in right away. So of course, they're not going to have images of the interiors because they weren't done yet.
But also on apartment hotels, Andrew, you had to have a restaurant, and the restaurant had to have an entrance from the building itself, not from the street, which was important. Having eaten in the Alden restaurant many, many times. My grandmother was supposed to be a great cook, but I never had one of her meals. We always ate in the Alden.
Very few of those hotel spaces hotel restaurant spaces are still there. The
Yeah.
one, if you eat at the Un deux Trois on like 44th or 45th Street, that is a hotel restaurant that still survives with its largely original design.
Wow, I want to check that out. Oh goodness. Oh goodness, everyone. Okay. I have a question from Alyssa. Hello. Does anyone know how Roth became the architect of the Adath Jeshurun synagogue on Rivington Street? The original congregation was Romanian, and then it became Polish. So she was wondering about that connection.
It depends on where in Romania they came from. It's Hungary owned most of Romania for a great many years. So they could have been from Transylvania, which was Hungarian, which was Hungary.
And from his autobiography, he talks about those early years where it just started to pick up, and then he would be used and someone would know, oh, who was your architect for this and that. So it was likely ended up being part of this community that was sort of sharing his name around. But I don't believe he explicitly says in his autobiography.
Thanks. Yeah, we had some questions actually about how he started to get work. Did Bing and Bing use him exclusively? And also we have some questions about what happened during the Depression.
Well, considering everybody on these 5 pictures, I was the only one there for the Depression. It was rather difficult, and there was very little work. As a matter of fact, our father went to work for Siska and Hennessy during that period. Again, there was no work, and he enlisted in the Navy. So what work there was working for banks who were repossessing buildings all through the Depression. And that's how a lot of architects made a living.
So he worked extensively for Bing and Bing throughout his career, but he was not the exclusive architect for Bing and Bing. Other architects were hired by Bing and Bing, but he was a favored architect.
Right.
He did. There was a little bit of work at the very beginning of the Depression. The Ardsley was begun in 1930, and we look back in hindsight with 20/20 vision. But in 1930, they didn't know that it was going to be so bad. So there's a little bit of work at the beginning of the Depression, and then the building basically stops. But there is something of a building boom that begins about 1935, 1936, and Roth did a significant number of buildings during that period, and I showed you a few. The Normandy, the one on the Grand Concourse, and a whole bunch on Fifth Avenue at that time. So work did pick up somewhat in the second half of the 30s.
But not enough really to keep an office going. Because
Yeah,
I
the
remember
office
the
staff was
office
much smaller.
when it was at 18 East 48th Street. And I used to go down there on Saturday mornings and sit at a drafting board and draw, because I love to draw. And my grandfather would come out and look at the drawings and then go back into his office. And he never talked to me about architecture, which I find amazing. Because he knew I was interested. I hoped he knew I was interested.
Well, we could stay here all night, and we still have so many folks with us, but I am very conscious of all of your time, and which I am very, very grateful for. So I'm going to wrap us here. Thank you all so very much. We are going to send out a video and hopefully a transcript. We are going to send out many links to books and to the archives, all kinds of things. So please keep an eye out for that. Teddy, Richard, Andrew, Shelley, thank you so very much for your time, for your expertise. And
May I thank you?
Oh, please do.
I really, both Teddy and I are very proud of Emery. We're very proud of our history. But to have this type of thing is just wonderful. And I can't thank you enough. So thank you all.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Take good care. Have a sweet night. Thanks for joining us from everywhere, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.